Before we get started, I have a few questions for you. This is not a pop quiz. Please don't panic, but I want you to think about your answer and then I'll give you the answer. So the first one is, when did Mary I become Queen of England? So when was she the Queen? Just kind of a ballpark figure. And the second question, which hopefully, there we go, is where is Mary buried? So just kind of try to put those answers in your head. So Mary I was Queen of England, and she was the first crowned queen regnant, which means she was the first crowned queen in her own right. And she ruled from 1553 to 1558. The second question is a little bit harder. She's actually buried in Westminster Abbey. A recent poll on Westminster Abbey's Twitter account revealed that many did not know that Mary was buried in Westminster Abbey, despite the fact that most knew that the Abbey was Elizabeth's final resting place. Significantly, Elizabeth and Mary share a tomb. I'll just let that sink in for a second. In the face of Elizabeth's 45 years on the throne and the lasting influence these years had on the English and British historical narrative, it's not surprising that her predecessor Mary's short reign is often overlooked. I would argue, though, that Mary is glossed over for reasons beyond her short tenure on the English throne. Instead, it is predominantly Elizabethan anti-Catholic and anti-Spanish feelings, which have led to Mary's forgotten state. Elizabeth's reign and the early years of James VI and I's time on the English throne are both marked by this anti-Catholicism. When combined with the influence of memory, we better understand Mary's legacy in the historical narrative. It is this legacy of Mary's posthumous fashioning in history which is the basis of this talk today. To start us off, let's talk a little bit about Mary, so we're all starting off on the same foot. Mary was born on February 18th, 1516, to Catherine of Aragon and Henry VIII. She was the only surviving child of her parents' marriage and suffered greatly during the King's Great Matter, when Henry VIII was attempting to find a way to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon so that he could marry someone who would hopefully give him a male heir. Mary was unapologetically supportive of her mother throughout these proceedings and suffered personally as a result. She was separated from her mother for the last few years of Catherine's life and wasn't even allowed to communicate with her. Later, she was sent to serve in her infant sister Elizabeth's household. During her brother Edward VI's reign, from 1547 to 1553, Mary remained piously Catholic and refused to compromise her beliefs in order to please her Protestant brother. In his last days, Edward VI signed his device for the succession, which declared that Lady Jane Grey, a cousin, would inherit instead of Mary. As you can imagine, Mary was not going to accept that without a fight. She rallied her forces and was eventually named queen shortly thereafter. She was crowned on October 1st, 1553, at Westminster Abbey, and so became England's first crowned queen regnant. She married Philip II of Spain on July 25th, 1554, at Winchester Cathedral, a marriage which came to be intensely disliked after Mary's death. Mary died on November 17th, 1558, and was laid to rest at Westminster Abbey. Because I'm going to talk today about specific moments of Mary's reign, I won't give and haven't given by any means a blow-by-blow account of her reign. But you should now have all of the information you need to understand the intricacies of the moments I'm going to cover. Before we get into the meat of this talk, it's important to ground ourselves in some memory theory. Group identity is created by individual members of the same group internalizing the same interpretation of memories and then using the shared memory as a prerequisite for inclusion in the group. Often, however, group identities become, as Rothberg terms it, a quote, zero-sum struggle, end quote, in which memory is seen as a battlefield with winners and losers. Only one narrative can be dominant in a society, so different groups with different collective memories struggle for their narrative to overcome the others. In this way, the dominant historical narrative comes to exist at the expense of all other narratives and group identities. As Bartlett argued, quote, memory conforms to interpretation, end quote. Anything that does not fit within these established narratives is rejected. This desire to fit an established narrative, as we'll see here, is why the English and British historical memory has overlooked Mary I in favor of her Protestant predecessor and successors. With that under our belt, we can begin to look at how Elizabethan writers interpreted and represented Mary's reign at two critical points, her pregnancies and her death. Any discussion about Mary and pregnancy necessarily talks about infertility and child loss. So if this is a sensitive topic for you, please be aware that I'll be talking about this over the course of this talk. The birth of a child is a significant moment in any parent's life, even more so when the royal mother is a queen regnant. Mary I twice had what she and her physicians believed to be pregnancies. I say believed to be because most historians agree that she was not carrying a child. There's still much debate on whether Mary had phantom pregnancies or tumors which mimicked the symptoms of pregnancy, but either way, she wasn't likely pregnant. Our modern scientific knowledge, however, does little to help us enter the early modern mindset, which believed that Mary was carrying an heir. To enter this frame of mind, we have to believe Mary was carrying England's heir to the throne. In her pregnancies, Mary took on the traditional role of queen consort, that of provider of heirs. At the same time, though, Mary was still the queen regnant, who held political authority in England. Her pregnancies are thus more complicated conceptually than any of her English royal predecessors. As a result, discussions of gender, religion, and national identity all intersect at the points of Mary's pregnancies, the first of which is our focus today. Once Mary's quickening was announced in 1554, it was met with rejoicing that, quote, care was exiled, since this little England, end quote, no longer lacked an heir. Prayers of thanksgiving praised God of his goodness for providing an heir which served to, quote unquote, recomfort English subjects. But as soon as, and indeed at the same time as, the echoes of the mandatory Te Deums dissipated in the London air, some began to question the veracity of Mary's conception. While many rejoiced that the succession would be secured with the birth of a healthy child, many feared the role that Mary's husband Philip II of Spain would play in the child's life, particularly if a regency was required. I should also clarify at this point here, the photo of the portrait on the screen is not Philip II, it is actually John Fox, who wrote the work that is on the left of the screen. These doubts about Philip's role were increasingly vocalized once Mary died, when it became safer to critique aspects of Mary's reign, and when it became clear that Elizabeth's England faced many of the same threats which Mary's marriage had introduced and which her pregnancy had strengthened. Elizabethan Protestant writers such as John Knox on the screen, Raphael Holinshed, and John Fox remember Mary's pregnancies as failures, as events which brought England perilously close to Spanish domination and Catholic supremacy. Some believed that Mary had, quote, been deceived by a tympany or other like disease, whereby she thought she was with child and was not, end quote. Some, such as Fox and Holinshed and his co-authors, suspected a darker explanation, in which Mary's pregnancies were simply, quote, spread for a policy, end quote, a way to secure a Catholic succession. There remained a fear of Spanish influence and a fear of Catholicism, which pushed Elizabethan authors to look for a scapegoat, someone on whom to blame the present unease. That scapegoat was Mary. Holinshed and his colleagues in both the 1577 and 1587 editions of their chronicle claims that, quote, some affirmed she was with child, end quote, was in the past tense, but that she had since miscarried. The 1587 edition, however, further suggests that Mary actively sought a newborn child who could be passed off as her own issue, a sort of 16th century precedent for the warming pan scandal of James VII and II and Mary of Modena in 1688. Fox had previously printed these same rumors of an adopted child in his 1583 edition of Acts and Monuments, which related the story of Isabel Malt. Isabel, according to her own report as relayed by Fox, had given birth to a boy on Whitsunday morning, the 11th of June, 1555, and had been approached by Lord North to give him the child, and from thenceforth swear that she had never given birth. Fox relates that Isabel was told that if she gave Lord North her son, then he, quote, should be well provided for, end quote. Fox and Holinshed's theories, either that Mary knew she wasn't pregnant but pretended to be for political expediency, or that she had been pregnant and had miscarried and sought to replace the lost child, both indicate an Elizabethan need to malign Mary and her fertility. If Isabel's story can indeed be trusted, then Fox and Holinshed establish that Mary was untrustworthy as a sovereign and had the interest of securing a Catholic succession for England ahead of ensuring a legitimate one. If Isabel's story is simply hearsay and rumor, then Mary remains the conniving queen, manipulating gendered expectations of her in order to secure her stability on the throne. If, however, Holinshed's original comment that Mary had indeed been pregnant and had miscarried is true, then he has effectively created her into a tragic, hysterical woman, so desperate to have a child that she imagines a pregnancy. Anti-Spanish sentiment also plays a significant factor. Few in England had wanted to see a Spanish marriage, not necessarily only because of religion. The number of those who opposed the marriage was larger than the English Protestant population, indicating a more widespread unease with Philip's foreign identity than with his religion. There was contemporary concern that a foreign husband would unduly influence Mary to the disadvantage of England, since it was assumed that she would conform to the traditional gender role of feminine submission to male authority. Mary's matrimony had brought, quote, an even more disturbing situation, end quote, to England, since it was now, quote, under bondage to the most fiercely Roman Catholic power in Europe, end quote. Christopher Goodman, reforming writer and minister, even argued that Mary had, quote, disregarded the authority of the scripture, which declares that Israel shall choose a king from one of their brethren, end quote. Mary had betrayed England into, quote, the hands of strangers, namely to the proud Spaniard, end quote. Her match with Philip II appeared to reinforce the renewed Catholicism of England, and her wifely devotion to him suggested, as the Constable of France noted, that he would take control of England and would make it a satellite state of Spain. When the regnal style of Mary and Philip was first proclaimed, the couple were introduced as Philip and Mary by the grace of God, King and Queen of England. His declaration as King of England gave credence to those who feared England would, if it had not already, become a servant of Spain. The Ballad of Joy, written after the announcement of Mary's first pregnancy, also identifies Mary not in her own right, but in relation to Philip, characterizing her not as Queen of England, but as, quote, the wife of King Philip, end quote. Another contemporary ballad, Heywood's A Ballad Specifying Partly the Manner, Partly the Matter, in the Most Excellent Meeting and Like Marriage Between Our Sovereign Lord and Our Sovereign Lady, the King's and Queen's Highness, also places emphasis on Philip as the superior member of the couple, naming him before Mary. Of particular note in this instance is that the rhythm of the ballad does not require Philip to be named first, since both Philip and Mary are two-syllable words where the emphasis is placed on the first syllable. Changing the order from Philip and Mary to Mary and Philip would thus not have changed the meter of the piece, suggesting that the order was a deliberate decision on Heywood's part. The tradition of naming the husband first was not new to England, or really to Europe, but for the first time it held political and religious implications. Never before had the husband not held ultimate authority in his own right in both the marriage and the realm. This negotiation of the role of a queen regnant and a king consort was a novelty in England at Mary's accession and marriage, and it's a negotiation which continued into Elizabeth's reign. Most of those speaking fervently in opposition to Mary's marriage to Philip were Protestants in exile, such as Knox, not those who remained in England. Knox originally printed the first blast of the trumpet at the very end of Mary's reign, but it was not until Elizabeth's accession that it was widely circulated and read, meaning that Fox's critique of female monarchy quickly had to be clarified as a critique of female Catholic monarchy, in order not to offend Elizabeth and risk her condemnation. It would seem, therefore, that Elizabethan concerns about Mary's wifely submission to a husband were emphasized by those who already had a bias against her and who were looking for a further reason to tarnish her name and authority. Fears of the supremacy of a king consort over a queen regnant continued beyond Mary's death, with Mary and Philip's marriage becoming a precedent for predominantly Protestant fears of the threat which a foreign husband brought to England's autonomy. These fears surrounding Philip and Mary's marriage were embodied in the conception, whether real or not, of their child, who would be raised with a strong Catholic and Spanish identity. Holinshed leveled the criticism that those who were most excited about the announcement of Mary's first pregnancy were those, quote, as seemed in England to carry Spanish hearts and English bodies, end quote. The perception that Mary's pregnancy was a triumph only for pro-Spanish residents of England further highlighted the general belief that this heir was less a child of England than a child of Spain. Further, if Mary died in childbirth, or indeed did not live to see her child's majority reached, a regent would be required. Parliament therefore took measures to ensure that the realm would be provided for if a regency was required. Naturally, this role was presumed to fall to Philip as the father, which greatly upset many Protestant English subjects, and which regency, during Elizabeth's reign and the increased tensions with Spain, was seen as a bullet which had thankfully been dodged. Holinshed notes retroactively that, quote, Englishmen have to render most earnest thanks unto Almighty God, who so mercifully against the opinion, expectation, and working of our adversaries have helped and delivered us in this case, which otherwise might have opened such a window to the Spaniards to have entered and replenished this land, that peradventure by this time Englishmen should have enjoyed no great quiet in their own country, end quote. Not only had England, at the end of Mary's confinement and acceptance that there would be no child, been spared Philip's influence as the father to Mary's heir, England had been spared a regency under Philip. This general relief at the lack of child is significant in Holinshed's chronicle because the relief is still felt at a time considerably distanced from Mary's pregnancy. With the benefit of hindsight, Holinshed was able to rejoice at the freedom from Spanish influence which Mary's barrenness occasioned, knowing as he did that Elizabeth continued to resist Spain, though it remained one of England's largest perceived threats. The perspective of hindsight provided by Holinshed allows for a different facet of analysis of Mary's pregnancy, ultimately decrying Mary in the English historical narrative as a Catholic anomaly wrongfully sympathetic to subjugation to a foreign power. Finally, since Mary's pregnancy had not been carried to term, this was another opportunity to paint Mary in a negative light. Fox related with the benefit of hindsight the parallel between Mary's condition and the succession of her reign more generally. Given the necessity of an heir to secure Mary's religious and political policies, he equated the lack of heir with disfavor from God, writing that God's response to Mary's persecution was to remove her husband and any unborn children from her. These are also similar arguments that we see in Knox's First Blast. So this questioned the efficacy of Catholic prayer and its ability to release souls from purgatory if it was unable to help Mary conceive and give birth. So if an heir meant a return to Catholicism, then the lack of heir signified the failure of Mary's return to Catholicism for England. Many asked and wondered, quote, how then it came to pass that all the Catholic Church of England did so err and was so deeply deceived. Holinshed even related exclusively in the 1587 edition that Mary had perhaps been, quote, bewitched, end quote, to believe that she was with child. The connections between Mary's pregnancy and her briefly enforced religious policies led many to equate Mary's physical barrenness with the barrenness of her goals. This is especially true in sources, Elizabethan sources, unsympathetic to Mary. Whether Mary was indeed carrying a child or not, her pregnancies greatly influenced the legacy and perception of her reign in the Elizabethan era. Female monarchy necessarily meant that the life of a monarch was in danger during pregnancy and childbirth, a threat not in evidence in male monarchy, because power remained with the monarch even if the mother of the child died. If Mary died in childbirth and the child survived, or if she died during her child and heir's minority, England would necessarily be left to a regent. This fear of the instability of regency was intensified by the fact that the most likely regent was Philip II, a Spaniard who was generally unpopular in England. Even if Mary survived the birth, Philip's role in the upbringing of the child would be significant, increasing yet further the fears that England was becoming subservient to Spain. Ultimately, the lack of heir meant that later Elizabethan writers could compare the barrenness of Mary's womb to the barrenness of her religious policies. In Mary's pregnancies, therefore, we see the intersection of gender, national identity, and religion in a way that had not heretofore been seen in England or the English historical narrative. In a similar way, Elizabethan attitudes largely controlled how people mourned Mary and the creation, or lack thereof, of her tomb. When Mary died, Richard Lant published a broadsheet entitled The Epitaph upon the Death of the Most Excellent and Our Late Virtuous Queen, Mary, which is on the screen here. This praised the late queen, though only briefly before Elizabeth's actions encouraged an addendum and reprinting. Possessing, quote, a princely liberal heart, end quote, and nothing but faith, mercy, and a variety of other virtues, Mary was, in Lant's description, a, quote, mirror of all womanhood, which no age could obscure, end quote. The majority of the epitaph continues in like praise, emphasizing Mary's devout Catholicism and her great ability as queen to show favor and mercy to her subjects. At the end, however, the tone changes significantly, demonstrating how memory can be intentionally altered to serve a present purpose. After his arrest and imprisonment for printing a tract so loyal to Mary, Lant added lines which praised Elizabeth as, quote, our just and lawful queen, in whom her sisters virtue rare abundantly are seen, end quote. He continued by urging readers to obey our queen and to pray that God may preserve her and, quote, send her grace, long life, and fruit, end quote. The abrupt shift from praising Mary to praising Elizabeth occurs only in the last handful of lines, suggesting that Lant was forced to temper his views on Mary in order to ensure favor with Elizabeth and avoid further imprisonment. Lant's epitaph is one example of a memory being altered, even if only superficially, as a result of its context. Already, Elizabeth was controlling the ways in which her sister and predecessor was remembered. More importantly, even though Mary's body no longer held any worldly power after her death, it continued, quote, to retain even accrue power, end quote, as the only anointed regnal body in the realm, though this power was now held by Elizabeth and her counselors, since they were in control of Mary's physical body. Elizabeth used this opportunity, both to commemorate her predecessor's death and to begin to establish her own reign. The overall cost of Mary's funeral came to approximately £7,700, well above the £3,000 normally spent on noble funerals, though it has been noted by historian Judith Richards that Elizabeth originally asked for only £3,000. The Elizabethan regime used Mary's funeral as an opportunity to promote their own intentions for the religion of the realm. It was, quote, a site of conflict, end quote, between Elizabeth I's new reign and the Catholic ascendancy, which had held favor under Mary, a division which was not healed by John White, Bishop of Winchester's funeral sermon. He chose as his scriptural base Ecclesiastes chapter 9, verse 4, which says that a living dog is better than a dead lion. Undoubtedly, White saw Elizabeth as the living dog and Mary as the higher prestige lion. He preached on the dangers of Protestantism and the judgment from God inherent without thought of repentance or returning to it, quote, willfully departed out of the Catholic Church, end quote. And that's highlighted on your screen here. He cautioned that a live dog, which barked at dangers to the church, was better than a dead lion, but in the same breath warned of, quote unquote, the wolves, which were emerging from Geneva, and against which Elizabeth, in his opinion, was taking little effective action. It was clear on which side White found himself. He mourned for the, quote, worldly detriment and discomfort, end quote, which appeared at Mary's death, while hoping to find comfort in, quote, the other sister, end quote. White was deprived of his bishopric and was imprisoned partly as a result of this sermon and partly because he refused to conform to Elizabeth's church. In a tangible way, Elizabeth and her counselors, too, were careful to manipulate the physical remembrances of Mary's life and death so that they best supported Elizabeth's reign and the narrative that they wished to create about Elizabeth and her rule. Mary's will had declared that she, quote, willed her body to be buried at the discretion of her executors, end quote, though requested that the burial proceed with, quote, such order and such godly prayers, suffrages, and ceremonies, as, with consideration of my estate and the laudable usage of Christ's church, shall seem to her executors most decent and convenient, end quote. A larger tomb was unnecessarily immediately, but Mary's final wishes were that she and her mother, Henry VIII's first wife, Catherine of Aragon, would be buried together at either Windsor Castle or Westminster Abbey, quote, within as short time as conveniently could be done, given that Catherine of Aragon's body needed to be moved from Peterborough. Mary also requested that her executors, quote, cause to be made honorable tombs or monuments for a decent memory, end quote, of both Mary and her mother. Mary's wishes were purposefully ignored. Though no Tudor monarch after Henry VII had commissioned royal memorials inside Westminster Abbey, Elizabeth's treatment of Mary's tomb was less one of negligence and more one of open hostility. Mary was left buried without her mother in the Henry VII chapel in the north aisle of Westminster Abbey, in an unmarked tomb covered by desacralized altar stones. Tombs were still being built in the abbey at this point. William Cecil had one built for his wife, and Elizabeth planned memorials for Henry VIII and Edward VI. Mary's tomb, though, was never begun, a signal that Elizabeth and her regime likely thought it was in their best interests to strengthen Elizabeth's reign by minimizing the role of her Catholic sister and predecessor. At this point, Elizabeth was still technically illegitimate and still barred from the succession. Even though her inheritance had been restored in 1543 by Henry VIII's will, this had been done, quote, only on the basis of paternal nomination, not lineal descent, end quote, meaning that legally Elizabeth still had a tenuous hold on the throne. It was in her best interest to avoid anything which drew attention to herself as Henry VIII's second child, born after a deeply divisive annulment and remarriage. Elizabeth's successor, James VI and I, had little motivation as well to create a memorial for Mary when he ordered a tomb to be built for Elizabeth. Believing that his mother, Mary, Queen of Scots, was the only heir to Henry VII, it is natural that he would want to discredit his predecessors, Mary and Elizabeth. He still, however, had to pay respect to Elizabeth, who had chosen him, albeit never explicitly, to succeed her. Since James was not English and was not an heir of Elizabeth's body, he had to secure his position as her natural successor. In order to do so, James ordered, in 1606, the removal of Elizabeth from her original grave in the Henry VII Chapel, and he commissioned a new grave for her in the north aisle alongside Mary, quote, pairing Elizabeth with her childless, unpopular, and Catholic sister, end quote. By building a glorious monument to Elizabeth, James attempted to harness for himself the loyalty the English people had held for Elizabeth. Any glory associated with her tomb would be reflected in turn onto James himself. It was, however, a subtle way for him to, quote, assert an equivalence that Elizabeth persistently refused, end quote. In death, she was as memorable, or not, as her sister and predecessor. The new position of her tomb emphatically, quote, marginalized Elizabeth's importance and foregrounded her childless state, end quote. Physically separated as her tomb was from the line of women who had birthed monarchs and consorts, including Margaret Beaufort and Margaret the Countess of Lennox. If the size of funerary monuments is a testament to an individual's symbolic power of the political body, then Mary's exclusion from her own tomb is telling. She is remembered in only one line of the engraving on the tomb, and is solely Elizabeth who appears in effigy. The lack of tactile remembrance to Mary effectively erases her from public memory. Relatively soon after Mary's death, it was already noteworthy that Mary had been forgotten by fortune and her successors. Her tomb is overshadowed by Elizabeth's, and so the building project ordered by James becomes, quote, nothing less than a deliberate attempt to undermine Mary Tudor's position in history, end quote. James VI and I's motivation in this building project are varied, though none are directly identified by James himself, instead being ones ascribed to him by later analysis. Memory theory is particularly prominent in contextualizing James's actions. Physical sites serve as tangible evocations of memory, often more permanent than the sermons or epitaphs which appear at a person's death. Both literary and material memory become sites of conflict when different groups have oppositional memory and narratives. Memorials, and in this case tombs also, stand, quote, for a particular interpretation of a shared history, end quote, even when that particular interpretation means the erasure of one figure in favor of the portrayal of another. When opposing narratives collide, as we have seen in these Elizabethan interpretations and representations of Mary's pregnancy and death, the question remains whether one exists solely after the destruction of the other. Elizabethan literature regarding Mary is a site of conflicted memory, in which these opposing narratives have clashed, and one has been declared the victor. The Catholic memory of Mary has been buried, figuratively and literally, under the Protestant narrative of England. I am more than happy now to take any questions that you have. My contact info is on the screen if you'd like to get in touch or if we don't have a chance to answer your question.
Okay, I should be here now, hopefully. You can hear me? I think you can.
Yes, I can hear you. Would you like me to leave this up?
Yeah, you can do if you want to, so people can see the your emails and Twitter, and so it'll be good so they can contact you if that's what they want to do. But it's a time where they can ask questions, as you said. So please do put questions in, and we're happy to ask them. Or I can ask forever because I've got a few myself. But please do, there's plenty of you. So if you want to ask a question, do put it in. But I think I'm going to ask the first question, Joe, and then hopefully people will feel more confident as we go ahead. My question, I guess, is about I'm a 19th century historian, and obviously we do see in that time period some revision of some historical characters in the past, but Mary doesn't. She's still seen quite negatively in the 19th century. Do you think that's to do with a lot of the anti-Catholic sentiment in the 19th century as well? Do you think that's going on? That she, other people who can be reshaped and reviewed, Mary's Catholicness that still is a problem for a lot of people in regard to that.
Yeah, absolutely. So we see in Victorian England, there's the Catholic Emancipation Act, and it basically returns some rights to Catholics in England. And so when this happens, there's a lot of pushback from a lot of Protestants who believe that this is just allowing Catholics to get into power and to make all the rules. And so Mary is pulled into the Victorian narrative as this precedent, as this terrifying figure, which she'll come back if you do this. And so she becomes, in a sense, a historical example as proof of why the present decisions are dangerous. And so she gets that rebirth, in a sense, of the bad Mary that we see in history. At the same time, we see biographies of the Strickland sisters who do one on the Queens of England, and Mary is included. But they, of course, are women writing in Victorian England. And so it's seen as oh, isn't that lovely? They're writing about something they know. And so it isn't really accepted as a true history. It's seen more as a kind of a fluffy biography that you might read. And so this revision that we start to have of Mary in the Strickland sisters' work isn't really seen as valid historical revision by the historians of the age.
Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating. I mean, I completely agree with everything you said there, because it's something that I've been looking at myself. So I had to ask the question just in case there was anything I missed with Mary. It's how people are using the past to make arguments in the present day, and Mary is one that people have been throughout the centuries. A usable history, I guess, is what term I use a lot in my work. But we've got questions. We've got people are throwing questions in, so I will move on from myself and go on to those questions. So the first question is from Pat, and she just asks, what did Mary die? How did Mary die, I guess, is the yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good question. We're not actually 100% sure. So in 1558, which hardly seems unimaginable to us now, there was a massive flu going around. And obviously it's not as bad as what we're seeing now, but many have thought historically that Mary had caught this flu and so had gotten sick. Okay. And so that might be part of it, that she was just an unfortunate victim of flu. There's also, I'm just going to go back to, this is the funeral effigy of Mary. And if we look, you'll see that in her abdomen, there is quite a noticeable bump, which many have attributed to a tumor. And so there is some speculation that Mary might have had ovarian cancer, which would obviously stop periods. So at the end of her life, she thought she was pregnant. And the longer it went along, the more she realized that she was just dying. And so if she had ovarian cancer, that kind of makes sense, because periods would stop, there would be bloating, there would be discomfort. And so we can see here that when she died, clearly there is a sense that her stomach is not kind of proportional to the rest of her.
Yeah, no, yeah, 100% you can see that, yeah.
Yeah, and so some people think that it's a mix of cancer and the flu. Obviously, historical chronicles have said, well, she lost Calais and died of a broken heart because of it. Probably just down to natural causes.
Yeah. Yeah, that sounds like the romantic version of that.
Yeah.
comes out of the 18th, the 19th. Yeah, they are quite fun to read to laugh sometimes. That's what I do anyway. I read to have a bit of a laugh. More questions. So Peter asks, wonderful talk. In terms of memory and representation, how significant do you think art is In particular, what do you make of different artistic portrayals of Mary, especially English depictions compared to French or Spanish depictions?
That's a really good question. So obviously art plays a massive role in how people are portrayed in history and how I think we see her portrayed as a queen. And so part of what happens in the English depictions are this tension between Mary as queen and Mary as spouse. And so we have, I've got to find it. There we go. I was gonna say, now's the time to realize I didn't put it in the talk. In the portrait on the left, we can see that Mary's in the right-hand position. So when you're looking at it, she's on the right-hand side. And so that's the position, of prominence. If you're going to get painted with someone in a portrait, you want to be on the right-hand side.
Okay.
And so that really shows that for English painting, Mary is trying to prove that I am the queen. Philip is just here as the husband of.
Yeah.
And so in a lot of English art of the period, it's all about trying to make that come across, that Mary is in the position of power. I can't speak too precisely. I know Peter can probably speak better to this than I can, knowing what he's working on. But the image of Mary in Spain is a lot more positive. And I would assume that that extends to artwork as well, because of course, when Mary marries Philip II of Spain, she becomes the queen consort of all of his territories. And so being predominantly Catholic, Mary is seen in Spain as this great queen consort. She is pious, she is Catholic, she's everything they want.
Yeah.
And so she is held up as this kind of perfect wife and queen. And so I would assume that that also figures in their artistic depictions of the period.
It makes sense, wouldn't it? It makes sense, wouldn't it? 100%. But very, very interesting. Again, artwork is so powerful. And people, I think, don't understand sometimes how powerful artwork was in this time period of making statements and what. But one more question, so let's keep going, because we keep going all day here, so it's great. So Chris asked, has there been any movement over time to fulfill Mary's will to be buried with her mother, or any sense of building a memorial shrine to Mary herself at Westminster Abbey or Winchester Cathedral?
So shout out to my parents. Hello. Yeah, I think there are quite a few of us who would happily go in and kind of put, the sticky note of like, Mary's here too, don't forget her. And we saw that a lot with the reburial of Richard III, and then calls for, well, if we have his DNA, why can't we unearth or disentomb the two princes in the Tower who are reportedly buried in Westminster Abbey? So there are two bodies that match descriptions, but we don't know 100% if those are the right people. But they're in Westminster Abbey. And so a lot of that discussion became, well, you can't unbury them. Like, that's disrespectful. And so a lot of, I think the same things would come up if there was discussion to change how they're buried so that they're beside each other instead of on top of each other. There's just, I guess, 400 years of this Protestant history that we have. And so I will be the first on that bandwagon to be like, yes, get a better tomb. But unfortunately, I think at this point, it's not going to happen because in itself, the tomb has become a historical monument, and those are very hard to change. But I wish we could. Even a plaque on the wall.
Well, do you think there's more opportunities to make plaques and other sites of remembrance to Mary? Because I don't think Mary has a lot of sites of remembrance to her. I mean, Elizabeth has more, I'd imagine. Again, I'm not an expert in this at all, but do you think there's more opportunity to do things like that, like make sites of remembrance to her, perhaps?
Yeah, I definitely think there's a possibility. We've seen in the last few years as eminent poets and authors have died, and scientists, that they have had plaques and monuments put into the Abbey. And so I don't think it's inappropriate for that to be a consideration. There's also a plaque. So there's Mary and Elizabeth's tomb. I'll try to see if it's in the picture I have on the slide. So there's Mary and Elizabeth's tomb. Edward VI is also buried with them, kind of off a little bit away from them, but in the same chapel. And on the floor, there's also a plaque to I forget the exact wording, but it's essentially a plaque to all of those who have died as a result of religious conflict in England. And so I think that's really interesting, that that's basically at the head of Mary and Elizabeth's tomb. And so I wouldn't find it strange to have a more modern interpretation put up, or even to have the interpretation card at the entrance to the chapel explain that a bit in more detail, that this is who's buried here, and kind of here's a brief history behind it, so that people know going in what they're seeing and who they're not seeing. Yeah,
I completely agree. I mean, that would be really handy and really helpful as well for people going to these places, because they, people going to places that don't necessarily know exactly what's going on here, and some help there would be absolutely important and great. So I would also join that bandwagon if you did that as well. I'll be second on that list. I've got some questions from some of the History Doors people, but I'm going to miss them for now. We'll go to other people. So Angela says, "Hi Joanna, really enjoyed your talk. I noticed in the portrait of Philip and Mary that Philip's head seems enormous, and he is standing while she is enthroned. Is this some sort of status statements, and is it going to be a portrait? I think you could do some of that, but his head is enormous."
Poor Philip. I'd actually never noticed that before. I'll have to go back and take a better look at this painting. So part of the seated or standing is another trying to adjust how status comes across. So Mary, as the queen, can sit whenever she decides she wants to sit. Everyone else can only sit in her presence if she says so. And so we have that power dynamic. Whether they meant that to come across in this painting or not, I don't know. But we have this image of the queen kind of sitting or perching on the throne, and Philip is standing beside his. So you can see it. I've lost my mouse. You can see his throne here, but he's not sitting on it. And so it's again that position that Mary is the queen and Philip has to kind of have respect for his wife, even though in the early modern world, he should have been the head of the household. And there's also the sense that because Mary is slightly seated, if she stood up, she would be taller than Philip, which is, again, a symbol of status because she is the higher up person. And so by being portrayed on the right-hand side, seated in a slightly higher position than Philip, it really shows the viewer of this portrait that Philip is there as the husband. He's kind of the arm candy, and she can do this all by herself.
Yeah. It's amazing, isn't it, that the height thing in paintings. I remember a painting once, I went around, I can't remember where it was now, where I think the wife was really much taller than the guy was, and so he made sure the perspective was so that he's seen as at least as same height or even a bit more taller. Just what people can do to make that height thing work. It was such an important thing, wasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
We've got another question from Neil. So he says, Which is a question. Is Mary's memory also obscured by a lack of positive achievements in her short reign, almost as much as it has been suppressed by Protestantism? For example, theatre and commerce that didn't flourish as much as it did under Elizabeth. Is that also a reason why her reign is, not seen in the same way as Elizabeth's?
Mm-hmm. I think part of what comes into that is just that Mary was on the throne for such a relatively short amount of time, that she's only queen for 5 years. And so she doesn't get the chance that Elizabeth does in 45 years. She doesn't get that chance to put policies in place and then have them play out. By the time they're starting to play out, she's dying and everyone is looking to Elizabeth as the next queen. But I think much of this anti-Catholic, anti-Spanish, anti-Mary sentiment is overshadowing the fact that she had a pretty stable reign. There were not massive panics because of flu. There were not massive panics because there were bad harvests. People were upset, obviously, and people were looking to her as like, you're the queen, do something. But there wasn't the sense of kind of rioting that she's not helping them. So we see that there's stability in the face of natural disasters, if you can call them that. And then we also see that she is actively engaged in battles, and that maybe not physically present, but that she has Philip off in France and he is fighting wars for England. And so we see that Mary's reign has this potential, I think, and that it has this stability and this sense of, I don't want to say mediocrity, but it has the sense of like, it's just going fine. Like there's nothing bad, nothing good. It's just kind of, it's there. And so that's, I think, partly why it gets written out, because, you have Elizabeth, you have the Armada, you have James, you have the gunpowder plot, you have all of this big stuff. And then Mary's reign is just, they keep on an even keel. And I think the biggest thing that happens, obviously in addition to religious persecution, which is its own kind of bubble, is the loss of Calais. And the loss of Calais, which happens so late into her reign that it kind of gets lumped with her death. And so we have that one big defining factor at the very end.
Yeah, it is absolutely. I think I completely agree. In that aspect, is a lot of reigns are noted for the big drama that goes on in their reigns, and perhaps Mary doesn't have that compared. I mean, you said the Armada, and even Henry the Eighth with all the split from the Catholic Church, and you've got the Charles, also my time period with the Civil War, like big moments, aren't they? Mary doesn't have them as maybe as crazy as those, perhaps. And because people do see history through big events.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. We've got some more questions. Probably these last few questions, and then we'll probably call it there because of time. So until those history indoors people who haven't answered your question, you can ask them in a round table. So I'll ignore those guys because I can do. Carmen asked a question: Has Mary's possessions been memorialised? If so, where will they be? Where can we find them, if we can?
Mm-hmm. I wish we had them. A lot of the jewelry that Mary would have had, a lot of her dresses would have gone to Elizabeth at her death. So it's, natural that the Queen has, according to the sumptuary laws in England, which say what rank of person can wear what, that Mary would own things that no one else could wear. And so it's natural to go, we have some cloth of gold. Just give it to Elizabeth. She can wear it. And so a lot of that would have gotten passed down. A lot of the jewelry would have got passed down. A lot of Mary's property that she holds as queen isn't actually hers. It's the crown's. And so it transfers, when she dies, would transfer to the heir. And unfortunately, we don't have yet any kind of clothing that we know was Mary's. You might remember from before the COVID times, there was a little exhibition at Hampton Court on the Bacton altar cloth, which is what many historians believe is part of one of Elizabeth I's dresses. And we don't have the same for Mary. We don't have anything identifiably hers, which is unfortunate.
Yeah, 100%. Because it's great, because especially being able to see these things with our own eyes would really bring it to life, I guess is the word I use, because we can kind of relate to, or we can kind of know that piece of artifact has a history that we can relate to. I always find that of history, that when you can see things from the period, it really does help and bring it to life a bit more.
And I should say that Winchester Cathedral has a chair, which is reportedly the one that Mary sat in for the wedding at Winchester Cathedral. But, you know, it's the right time period, it's the right fabric, like it's everything is the right thing, but we can't definitively go, yes, there's no portrait of her in the chair. There's no talk among chronicle writers of, ooh, like look at the throne she had when she was there. And so there's this, that we don't have anything definitively Mary, but we have one tantalizingly close thing that we can never prove.
That's the worst thing, because like it's like so close, but yet so far. Last question for you, Johanna. How important is personal memory in creating the image of Mary? Peter specifically referring to Jane Dormer's account and the visits Mary made to the poor in disguise. Obviously, personal memory I think is quite crucial. I mean, or even personal memory I think is another way you could look at it. You know, because there are obviously public ways of remembering. What's that personal ways of remembering as well? You know, is there any of these of Mary?
Yeah, I think the problem that we get when we have the Elizabethan settlement during Elizabeth's reign is that all of a sudden this settlement basically institutes official Protestantism in England. And so Catholicism is driven underground. People have to pray the rosary, you know, like with one hand in your pocket in case someone comes in, that kind of thing. And so these personal memories, you can share them in a certain network of people, but like Jane Dormer, she marries one of Philip's Spanish subjects who has come over with Philip. And she ends up, I think, going back to Spain. And so by the time that Elizabeth comes to the throne and Catholics who would have been very loyal to Mary are realizing there's not really anything in England left for them. And so either they go underground and can't share their memories and can't share their view of Mary as the woman and not the queen. They can only share those to some people. And so that all of a sudden there becomes this Catholic memory of Mary and then this other official memory of Mary. And the same way that many Protestant or reformers leave England during Mary's reign and go to the continent because they don't want to be Catholic. We see the opposite happening in Elizabeth's reign, is many Catholics, if they don't go underground, they leave. They go to places that are more open to Catholicism. And so they bring their memories of Mary with them. And so it becomes almost a sense that these personal memories of Mary are either underground and you know if you're in the know, or they leave and get put into international histories as opposed to domestic histories.